Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Elizabeth Threlkeld, and I'm the director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. We are fortunate to be joined today for a discussion on Afghanistan's evolving terrorism landscape under the Taliban by three real experts on that issue. And we are going to be doing double duty this morning. So we find ourselves 3 years out from the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And we're also going to be celebrating the launch of a recent book by Stimson Center's non-resident fellow Amira Jadoon and Andrew Mines. It's called The Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Strategic Alliances and Rivalries. So as you all know, 3 years ago this week, we saw the fall of the Ghani government in Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban to power, and the hasty withdrawal and evacuation of remaining US forces and affiliated Afghan civilians. In the 3 years since, the Taliban have consolidated control over the country and managed to achieve a level of stability, albeit stability by force, that has surprised many analysts. They have failed to live up to early promises of a less draconian approach to human rights. They've denied women and girls professional and educational opportunities, and they've limited opportunities for minorities. Under their watch, international terrorism has also emerged as a significant concern. Through large-scale attacks in both Iran and Russia earlier this year, the Islamic State-Khorasan Province demonstrated both its intent and its capacity to strike externally. Just last week, the UN's Undersecretary General for Counterterrorism described the group as Europe's, quote, greatest external terrorist threat. We've also seen the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the Pakistani Taliban, surge in its own attacks following the Taliban takeover, with attacks more than doubling from 2022 to 2023, and a trend that has continued this year. Pakistan's security forces have borne the brunt of these attacks, with the TTP allegedly receiving safe haven and support from various factions of the Afghan Taliban. We'll focus our attention this morning on those issues, on Afghanistan's evolving terrorism landscape, reflecting on the developments that we've seen over the past 3 years of Taliban rule, with an eye towards where the situation is headed and also what it means for US and regional interests. We couldn't have a better panel to take us through this complex set of issues. I'm really pleased that you all were able to join us today. To start with, I'll introduce Dr. Amira Jadoon, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Clemson University. She's also a non-resident fellow of our program here at Stimson. Prior to joining Clemson, Amira worked at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, jointly appointed in the Department of Social Sciences and the Combating Terrorism Center. She holds an external appointment at the International Center for Counterterrorism and specializes in international security, political violence, and CT strategies. She's fluent in Urdu, Hindko, and Punjabi, and holds a PhD in political science and an MSc in economic development. Next up, we have Dr. Aryan Shafiri, who's a lecturer and chair of the Master in Public Policy program at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. He came to Princeton with a decade and a half of high-level practical experience in Afghanistan and internationally, having served in multiple positions in the former Afghan government, notably as Director General of the National Threat Assessment in the Office of the National Security Council, as well as Senior Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Kabul. He's fluent in Dari, Pashto, and English, and understands Urdu. Last but not least, we have Iftikhar Firdos, who is a journalist and writes on conflict and the gaps in governance that it causes. He's the founding editor of the Khorasan Diary, a nonpartisan platform that provides real-time information and analysis based on facts and keeping in view ground realities. It's a joint collaboration of credible journalists, researchers, and academics from across the world, and one of its kind. It's a fabulous resource if you haven't checked it out yet. Just as a reminder to our audience, I know there are already questions that are rolling in, which is great. Please do use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Add those questions as they come up, and we'll get to as many as possible in the hour and 15 minutes we have today. For now, I will turn things over to Amira to take us through the highlights of her book on ISKP. I should say for our audience as well, you can use the promo code FALL24, all one word, for a 40% discount on her book. And also be on the lookout for a new version that's coming out, not the hardcover, but the soft copy later this fall in October, I believe. So congrats again on that, Amira, and over to you for a summary of your book.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for joining us online. I agree with Elizabeth. We couldn't have a better panel here with Aryan and Iftikhar, so really happy to be a part of this. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to discuss my book on ISK, which was released around March last year, which I co-wrote with Andrew Mines. And we released our book last year, and it really is a culmination of a lot of work that we have been doing on ISK since its emergence in 2014 or 2015, depending on when you start the clock on it. But given that ISK is pretty much in its 10th year of existence, a lot of our findings from the book are unfortunately still really relevant. So what I'll do here today is keeping to my time allocated to me, which will be a challenge, but I'll try my best. I'll start off with just discussing the motivation for writing this book, provide an overview of the methodology we used, the sources that we used, and really the overarching question and our argument. And I'll try and integrate some of the recent developments that we have been observing with regards to ISK's behavior, particularly its sort of pivot to an international agenda, the change in its tempo, its targeting priorities, and really talk about how our argument still applies to what we are observing today, and also gain some insights into how ISK tends to adapt to its changing environment within Afghanistan, within South and Central Asia in general. So as you know, ISK first emerged late 2014, early 2015, and essentially it extended Islamic State's goal of creating a caliphate into South and Central Asia. And while ISK is closely aligned with its parent organization and sort of subscribes to its ideology and its goals, its operational focus historically has really been on modern-day South and Central Asia. Now, at the outset, when ISK first emerged, it wasn't really seen as a potential threat, which may grow into not what we're seeing today. And, this was kind of fair because there were a lot of challenges that it faced at the outset. So as we all know, anyone who observes South and Central Asia, the area is crowded with a host of militant groups of different types: sectarian, anti-state, ethno-nationalists, and also those which maintain links with states. Additionally, there was already Al-Qaeda present there in the region, although subdued, but still it was Islamic State's rival. And at the time of ISK's emergence, the US was still present in Afghanistan, and across the border, the Pakistani army had gained significant experience engaging in counterterrorism as a partner in the war on terror. Now, in 2024, as I mentioned, ISK's 10th year of existence, I think one thing that we can all agree upon is that ISK has repeatedly demonstrated that it has a really tenacious grip in the region, and it may fluctuate in its operational tempo, but its ability to adapt to its environment and continue to exploit security gaps, even when they change, is really something which needs to be explored. So despite all these challenges that ISK faced at the outset, and we saw subsequently that it lost all the territorial control it had in Afghanistan, and it experienced extreme human capital losses in terms of its top leaders, but also its rank and file militants. But the group always retained its ability to inflict violence and really conduct all these spectacular, devastating attacks, fluctuating depending on whether it was targeting state actors more or civilian actors more. And at least twice before, once in 2018 and then again in 2022, the group has been named as one of the deadliest organizations in the world after being declared defeated several times. And today, ISK finds itself in this new environment, which has allowed it to implement its plans to become a more regional organization, which has global influence. And of course, we can talk about how directly or indirectly ISK has been linked to some of these external attacks that we have seen in Iran and Moscow, and also the series of plots that we have been seeing in Western Europe. So it's at this point where it's not just a threat to its immediate region, but also is threatening the stability of international security through these indirect or direct linkages. Now, ISK's slow revival after 2018-19 really started in mid-2020, I would say, and we have seen it continue to endure. So the questions that we really address in the book are what explains ISK's resilience, its rise, its decline, and then subsequent resurgence? What exactly has enabled ISK to compete with militant groups such as the Taliban, survive CT operations? And some of the sub-themes that we explore in the book, really, we look at the evolution of ISK's operational capacity in the face of intense counterterrorism operations, as well as its clashes with the Taliban. We leverage some of the data that we collected on counterterrorism outcomes, leadership decapitation efforts against the group, to gain insights about its leadership structure and how diverse its militant base has always been, which is sort of connected to its transnational attacks today. And we dive deeper into the specific ways that ISK has maintained and nurtured not just its alliances, but also its rivalries, obviously most notably with the Taliban, to really endure in the region, right? And just its general survival. So we adopted a multi-source approach, which incorporated original data sets on attacks, targeting priorities, primary materials, but we were also fortunate enough to gain access to some of the internal documents from ISK. And then finally, we used a variety of secondary sources. So the main argument in the book that we make is that ISK essentially adopted a two-pronged approach where it simultaneously relied on building a network of alliances while provoking dominant groups in the region, right? And this continues to be a part of its strategy today. Its linkages allowed it to localize its jihad, but also build this sustainable militant base, which is very diverse. And its rivalries allow it to present itself as an alternative jihadist platform for other militant factions, which were previously connected to the Taliban insurgency, for aggrieved populations, and various other militants as a partner, but also really as an umbrella organization. And one of the reasons for this appeal, ISK's appeal to a diverse body of militant factions, is that its agenda is very broad. It targets and it vilifies various governments in the region, and it's essentially fused its global narratives with very sophisticated localized narratives, which really allows it to appeal to a wide variety of militants wherever, regardless of whatever their top priorities may be. Now, we can see that ISK's rivalries, especially with the Taliban, have continued to yield important dividends, which sort of have come in the form of being able to expand its recruitment even more so than before. And I guess what I would like to say sort of in my concluding remarks before I hand it over to the next panelist is that the environment that ISK found itself in after the US withdrawal and the Taliban's takeover, I would argue is the most permissive environment for it, because it allows it to capture the militant market as an umbrella organization and really serve as a resistance platform for a wide variety of aggrieved populations. And this is some of what we are seeing now that ISK, after the US withdrawal and the Taliban takeover, saw itself in a position where it could start implementing its regional strategy and also influencing individuals across the world, but specifically in Western Europe. So I'll stop there. I do have a lot more to say, but hopefully I can get the opportunity in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Amira. And I think that's actually a really good segue to Aryan, particularly highlighting the role of the Taliban, right? This massive change in environment that we saw with the fall of Kabul in August of 2021 and what we've seen in the subsequent 3 years. So Aryan, I'd be particularly grateful for your thoughts on how the Taliban have come to approach their counterterrorism efforts. As Amira just pointed out, ISKP is essentially the opposition group at this point, competing with the Taliban in the space. So how have they approached it? How successful have they been? And how do CT efforts fit into the broader international community's tacit engagement efforts with the Taliban?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and hello to everyone who's joined us today in this webinar. I actually had a recent trip to Afghanistan after about 3 years, in which I had meetings and extensive discussions with the top Taliban leadership in the security sector on these very matters. So it is there's quite a lot to talk, but in this given brief period of time, I'll try to give you some highlights on their commitments, on the Taliban commitments to counterterrorism, the Doha Accords, and also where they are and how they are doing. Now, if you look at the Doha Agreement, the agreement at least had 5 major issues, 5 major points in which the Taliban committed themselves. Number one was allowing the safe passage of American personnel and equipment. Number 2 was the provision of close air support by American military while during the time that they are exiting, in extreme cases, to Afghan national defense and security forces. The third commitment the Taliban made in the Doha Agreement was to deny space for all terrorist groups in Afghanistan. Fourth, of course, was to engage in peace negotiations with the former Afghan government that would result in a shared power sharing agreement and hopefully at the time an inclusive government. And number 5 was the continuation of what the U.S. called over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations for the foreseeable future by the United States military forces. So these were the 5 main commitments that the Taliban made in that agreement with the United States. Now, in terms of, as we know, most of these agreements, these commitments actually did not take place. And specifically on counterterrorism, the picture seems to be very complex. Now, as we all know, there are some 24 to 26 terrorist groups, foreign terrorist groups, currently operating in Afghanistan. There are a number of Pakistani groups, including the TTP and the Lashkar-e-Taliban, Lashkar-e-Jangvi, and Sipahi-Sahaba, and what have you. There are at least 3 regionally oriented terrorist groups. We have the ETIM or TIP, the Chinese Uyghurs. We have the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Uzbeks, and we have Jamaat Ansarullah of Tajikistan. So these 3, at least, regionally oriented terrorist groups. And then finally, globally oriented terrorist groups, we have Al-Qaeda, of course, and then we have ISKP. Now, what the Taliban are claiming is that out of these 24 plus minus groups, the 23 are absolutely under control, that their leadership are under control, their movements in Afghanistan are under control, that they are not posing any threat to the region or beyond. When it comes to ISKP, then, of course, the Taliban claim that they've been, over the past 3 years, they've been conducting severe counterterrorism operations against that. What they claim to have done, number one, is that the Taliban are saying that they've denied territory to ISKP. And that is kind of verifiable. It's pretty obvious. Now, before the Taliban take over in a number of places within Afghanistan, especially in eastern Afghanistan, in the province of Kunar and Nuristan, ISKP did hold territory. But now there's really no evidence to suggest that ISKP does hold territory inside Afghanistan. So denial of territory is one achievement that the Taliban are claiming to have made against ISKP. Then they claim that they have arrested over 2,000 members of ISKP, and they have them in their prisons right now. In fact, they're saying that anybody who wants to verify, they're more than welcome to come, and we will show these people, these 2,000 plus ISKP members, to them. And third, they claim that over the past 3 years, they've actually killed over 500 of ISKP members. They gave me an extensive list. Let me name a few. They claim to have killed Qari Fateh Kotri, who was the deputy ISKP. They say they claim to have killed Engineer Omar Haidar, who was in charge of the central zone of Khorasan Province. They claim to have killed Maulawi Ziauddin, who was the head of ISKP judiciary. They claim to have killed Abu Omar Afridi and a number of others. I have an extensive list, and I'd be happy to share that. So they are saying that the other 23 that I mentioned are under control, that they've made no movement in terms of threat against the region or beyond. And when it comes to ISKP, that ISKP's operational capability is much lower now than it used to be 3 years ago. And they're also claiming that the top leadership of ISKP no longer lives in Afghanistan, but they are in Balochistan area of Pakistan. That's what they're saying. Now, to really put all this together and do a little bit of an assessment, how I assess that is I do feel that the Taliban do have the will to fight against ISKP. They are really committed to do that. But they are really lacking in operational capability to conduct really effective counterterrorism against ISKP. I mean, now we all know any effective counterterrorism strategy would have to include what we call really anti-terrorism measures, which is really defensive measures. It has to have operational counterterrorism measures, which is really the kinetic military intelligence aspect of CT. And then, more importantly, really, it will have to have strategic counterterrorism, what we call. So basically measures that would reduce the space to the birth, growth, and expansion of terrorism. Now, the Taliban have really conducted operational counterterrorism against ISKP, but they're really lacking on defensive measures, and they're also really unaware, they don't really understand the strategic aspect of counterterrorism, specifically when it comes to ISKP. Now, number two is on the other terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, the TTP, and the other groups that I mentioned. Of course, the Taliban are claiming that all of these groups are under control, that no threat is posed by them to the region and beyond. The problem is verification. How do we verify that what they actually say is true? There are reports that the number of Al-Qaeda figures have moved into Afghanistan. Abu Ikhlas al-Masri, for instance, was in charge of intelligence of Al-Qaeda, is said to be living in Afghanistan. Abdurrahman al-Ghamidi is believed to be moving between Iran and Afghanistan. A number of other Al-Qaeda operatives, some reports suggest that they are there. With regard to the TTP, of course, there are a lot of claims, especially by the Pakistani government, that the TTP is under the wing of the Afghan Taliban. Now, it's very difficult really to verify whether the Pakistani government is telling the truth or the Taliban are telling the truth. So verification of effective counterterrorism with regard to these other groups is really a big challenge. And so when there's no verification, it's very difficult to hold the Taliban accountable with regard to any of the commitments. Now, really to put it all together and conclude on the way forward, and some of the stuff that I write or some of the talks that I have, either with the US government or with other European governments or even with the United Nations or anybody relevant to this matter, what I try to do is to give some advice on what would be the way forward. And honestly, what I really see the way forward, the only solution to this whole problem, which is unfortunately expanding and extending and intensifying, is really to help build an accountable government in Afghanistan. Now, this one-way Taliban government cannot really and should not continue into the future. The only way to hold the Taliban, hold Afghanistan really accountable to this whole threat scenario is really to have an accountable government in there, a power-sharing government, a government in which the Taliban would be a part, but also others would be a part, a government that would be based on law and not based on decrees from Kandahar. That is really the only way. And then, the question of leverage comes in. I believe the international community, particularly the United States, does have a lot of leverage. This is something, when I'm talking to the Taliban leadership, I feel that the United States, the international community in general, do have pretty good leverage. It's just about really the question of how committed the international community is to bringing some change, some positive change in Afghanistan, not only for the Afghan people, but also for these threats to be, in a way, reduced and to be managed. I'll stop here, and if there would be any specific questions with regard to what the Taliban are really doing, I'd be happy to get more into detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aryan. And I think that brings us nicely to Iftikhar, who obviously has followed this very closely from across the border in Pakistan, which itself finds some challenges, particularly from the Afghan Taliban, but also from ISKP in the spillover effects that we are seeing from these groups, and as well some bilateral challenges between Afghanistan and Pakistan that continue to play out. So Iftikhar, curious from your perspective, how these groups, both ISK, TTP, and others, impact the broader regional CT landscape, including in Pakistan, and how the Taliban has responded to some of those challenges and how this is playing out bilaterally as well. Over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for the rest of the panelists to actually open up the discussion in this way. I think they've really set the tone for this discussion. Coming up always last to answer questions, you have that certain kind of space where you have less to say, but more to explain on what others have actually said. So I'll take my liberties with the discussion as well. The broader cities landscape in Pakistan, if you look at it in the current circumstances, I mean, if I can explain with even today, today is the 14th of August, which is Pakistan's Independence Day, and you have at least 17 attacks taking place in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which is bordering Afghanistan, and then you have at least about 8 attacks taking place in Balochistan today, just statistically speaking. And if you look at the range of attacks, as you mentioned also, that there's about double the increase since 2023. When we look at the spectrum of index in terms of Pakistan attacks within Pakistan, 2009 was one of the years where Pakistan suffered the brunt of attacks, which is the largest. 2023 well surpassed that, over 100 attacks. But in terms of impact, as Amira has put it also very nicely, that the Pakistan military as well as its auxiliaries somehow in the last 20 odd years have been CT trained in such an extent that the impact of these attacks has not been as massive as it was in 2009. So you don't actually feel it that way, but the larger CT spectrum is obviously disorienting the government in different ways. Number one is the economically, and secondly is politically as well. So you see the after effects of what happened in Afghanistan 2021 really spilling over into Pakistan. From the Pakistani perspective and what the government is trying to say, I think they're blatantly criticizing, the Afghan Taliban now. There have been statements which were initially post-2021 a little tepid, but then we've seen Pakistan never go, into Afghan soil. We've seen 3 times jet bombardment in Afghan territory by Pakistanis so after that. And I think it's overwhelming and surprising for the Pakistanis who put so much faith behind the governance system of the Taliban, which has sort of turned around the table 180 degrees, for them to realize that this is not something that they expected to happen. While ISKP obviously remains a global concern, and for reasons, because obviously our own interest as researchers, as journalists, we see ISKP growing from this local affiliate of the Islamic State into now having global tentacles and having this power to actually not just not die out, but also expand. But on Pakistan's perspective, whenever the international community puts in the question for ISKP or ISPP, as Aryan has put it, the blame game from Pakistan and Afghanistan, what we see is a reversal of roles actually. Previously it was the Afghan Taliban that were the Quetta Shura based out of Balochistan, and now the Afghan Taliban are blaming that the Pakistanis have ISKP in Balochistan. It's just a reversal of roles, and what we see after 2001 is almost in similar style, insurgent groups forming together. But what it actually means for a global audience and what it actually means for the region is that if this buildup that is taking place in Afghanistan of these multiple groups, and one of the reasons for that in terms of, I agree with Aryan, is that to identify them for the Taliban as well as for the global community on who is involved in what we see post-2021 is a level of fluid identities between militant and terrorist organizations. So a person could be associated with the Al-Qaeda, he could be part of the Afghan Taliban, he could be part of the TTP simultaneously. And this is not just verbatim per se, but even propaganda that has been disseminated by these groups. Some of those lost publications which disappeared after 2001, when American forces and allied forces entered into Afghanistan, they have begun republishing those. And it's very evident from the level of propaganda that's being produced of the larger collaborations that are taking place between Al-Qaeda, the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, as well as how jointly they are operating. Pakistan might be suffering the brunt of it because it has a history. It also has a tacit support from somewhat a limited number of areas in terms of population for welcoming some of these groups. Although on a state level, it is not usually accepted, but obviously if for an insurgency to survive in a certain locality, there has to be some level of local support in that population for it to actually thrive on. But in terms of the larger city landscape on what it could have detrimental effects for the region, Kirman and Russia and Moscow, which is Crocus Hall, are just symptoms of a larger problem that will increase. The TTP remains a problem for Pakistan. I mean, obviously, that's very clear statistically as well. There have been claims from the Pakistani side that the Afghan soil is involved. Obviously, the top leadership of the TTP in terms of its leadership and presence is very openly within Afghanistan. So there is nothing to deny about that. It's something that they've actually even very open about to speak about themselves as well. But as far as ISKP is concerned, I think one of the larger problems, Amira has explained quite a bit, so I won't repeat a lot of it. But in terms of reaction, when 9/11 took place, there was an area, a specific group that was there for which a counter reaction was expected, that this is Afghanistan and the world has to go after the specific group. As far as ISKP and how it's grown, and in terms of some of the investigative files that we've witnessed on how these operations are planned, in which multiple countries are involved simultaneously, not just for the logistical support, but as well as the financial support. So Afghanistan might be just one bit of it now, because post 2020, we see ISKP, the digital caliphate, coming into the increasing footprint digitally, where even when you ask investigators within the CT domain to actually explain how these certain attacks have taken place, there are nothing else or nothing more remains than just accept Telegram IDs or some digital footprints apart from that. I know that we're short on time. There's a lot of explain to explain on this, but if tomorrow an attack takes place in the West, what would be the reaction in terms of vis-a-vis ISKP? Because their operations are so scattered, I think Afghanistan alone will not be the only country that would be to blame, because the spectrum of ISKP's operational capability has now far increased beyond Afghanistan. And I think that it requires more research. It also requires more resources for states. And I think one country's CT effort will not be enough to stop ISKP's operation. I think it has to be a large conglomerate that has to come on. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Iftikhar. And that's a great segue back to a question that I want to pose to Amira, but welcome thoughts as well from Ariane and Iftikhar. One of the transitions that you very usefully highlighted in your book, Amira, is how we've seen the evolution of ISK from an entity that has a real territorial base, primarily in Nangarhar, but not exclusively, to an entity that is more based in urban areas, kind of more of the sleeper cell model, the digital caliphate, as Iftikhar just called it. I wonder if you could shed some light on how ISK has navigated that transition, if that really captures where the group is now, and how that aligns with some of the broader trends that we're seeing just in terms of demographics in Afghanistan and the wider region with increasing urbanization, right? This is everything from youth seeking economic and educational opportunities. It can also be climate change induced as well. It seems like some of those trend lines in Afghanistan and more broadly in the region are moving in the direction of greater urbanization at the same time that seemingly overlaps with ISK's kind of evolved recruitment strategy. Help us understand the rural and urban dynamics of recruitment of ISK and where you see this trajectory headed, if you could.
Yeah, great question, Elizabeth. Thank you for that. So I think just to take a step back, because of the territorial losses and obviously in terms of strength numbers, right? ISK is much weaker than its peak years. But what we see ISK sort of do under its, new visionary leader, who has yet to be killed, which is different than all the previous leaders of ISK. It took a number of steps, right? But it also closely subscribes to the IS insurgency model, the Islamic State insurgency model. So we have to remember that it is, after all, an affiliate of IS. So what we see immediately after the withdrawal of the US and the Taliban takeover, that first, ISK expands the type of warfare that it's conducting. So again, we see some guerrilla warfare, but also more urban attacks. And for terrorist groups, targeting civilians in urban areas tends to yield high number of casualties, which can be really beneficial for a group in terms of sort of reinforcing its image, right? But also indicating its resolve, not just to the state, but also to other militant groups and to various audiences that is trying to recruit from. So ISK has focused on targeting or conducting attacks within urban areas because they're more deadly, but that also gives them an opportunity to target minorities, especially the Shia minorities and Hazaras, which is a fundamental part of its ideology and goals. But what we also see is more targeted assassinations of Afghan leaders or various local level leaders as well, which again require fewer resources, but these are high impact attacks. And what we saw also was attacks on foreign presence within Afghanistan, cross-border attacks into Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and then finally this trying to recruit from afar, right? So using its global ideology to target audiences in the West who already may feel alienated from their home governments. So I think this sort of focus on urban attacks really is kind of fits in nicely given ISK's current strategy that it doesn't have any territory, but it still needs to create some impact, right? And you're right to say that we have more urbanization in all of these areas, which also means we have large populations of youth who also are deprived of opportunities. So it's almost a perfect storm, which ISK is well positioned to exploit. Now, within Afghanistan, again, al-Muhajir has really emphasized guerrilla warfare tactics, which again subscribe to the IS insurgency model, emphasizing secrecy, hit and run tactics, until the group is strong enough again to start developing hideouts, but also safe pockets of safe havens. But right now, the goal is to inflict the maximum harm upon the enemy, which is the Taliban, through rural and urban warfare, targeted assassinations of government and religious leaders, and also conducting fewer but more sophisticated attacks to maximize the impact of it all.
Thanks, Amira. Iftikhar, over to you.
I just wanted to add two bits to what Amira has actually mentioned. In terms of trends, we look at ISKP's internal recruitment patterns in Pakistan and Afghanistan based a lot on old religious lines, because some of the top leadership of ISKP that actually came in from older jihadist entities such as Al-Qaeda, TTP, and the Afghan Taliban, majority of them were known, and majority of them have been killed also in CT ops since 2000. And rather, by 2017, ISKP had lost almost 60% of its top known leadership. What has emerged after that is a much younger leadership as well as much younger recruitment pattern. And obviously, if you as a terrorist entity when you're actually looking to recruit between Pakistan and Afghanistan and you do not have physical presence. Your reliance on the internet means targeting the more urban space. There has been visible proof that ISKP has been using social media and even as gaming platforms as well as such as PlayStation as well as Nintendo also to recruit. And there is proof enough that people were actually motivated from the more elite backgrounds in Pakistan and Afghanistan that were attracted to the ideology. But for its internal dynamic within the jihadist sphere, ISKP in its 1.5 year term since 2021, it started moving into a pattern where it actually took the war to the Taliban, first based on its operational model on how the Taliban was. But now we see, since the beginning of this year, that ISKP now is targeting the belief system of the Taliban. What it is trying to do is it's trying to ostracize the Taliban from the entire global jihadist entity, along with Al-Qaeda. But there is still somewhat capacity to talk to Al-Qaeda. But the Taliban as a movement, whether it's its Pakistani affiliates or the Afghan affiliates, are being totally ostracized. And there is no physical action against its Pakistani affiliates, while it is pretty much there. The attacks against the Afghan Taliban are there. But what it's actually trying to do is it's trying to recruit from within these groups that already exist based on the actions that it has been predetermined.
Thanks, Iftikhar. Aryan, feel free to jump in.
Very quickly, from what I am actually seeing, and this may be slightly different from what Amira and Iftikhar said. Number one, I have not seen, at least over the past 3 years, really any indication of ISKP engaging in guerrilla warfare. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Before the takeover of by the Taliban, they did hold some ground, and they did engage in some guerrilla warfare tactics against us, against the Afghan government. Now, it's the opposite. They don't have territory. In fact, my assessment is that it was deliberate. It's a deliberate decision by Sanaullah Ghaffari or Shahab al-Muhajir, the leader of ISKP, to really change from a semi-insurgent, semi-terrorist group into a fully terrorist group after the Taliban takeover, because when the Taliban were fighting the Afghan government, the then Afghan government, given the fact that much of our pressure was really against the Taliban because they were the larger force, the bigger enemy at the time, that did allow ISKP to hold some territory and engage in some guerrilla warfare. Now, engaging in guerrilla warfare does require some territory. You can't have that without having some territory. So over the past 3 years, I have not empirically seen any sign of that. And second, at least for the past year, and then this may go a little bit against, counter to what Iftikhar was saying, there hasn't been any spectacular ISKP attack against the Taliban. Now, before that, they did. They killed a number of commanders. They killed a number of Taliban governors. But now their operations inside Afghanistan over the past year has been very limited, and that's been specifically focused on soft targets, really targeting Shia Hazara community in Afghanistan. And then they've been focusing really on external operations where they recruit individuals. And this happened to be for obvious reasons, may not be that obvious, but definite reasons, of Central Asian origins across the world. The information I have is over the past 6 months, at least 12, at least that I know of, 12 ISKP cells in Europe, in Madrid, in Strasbourg, in Berlin, in Bonn, in London, and in a few other places have been apprehended, and individuals have been arrested. And all of those individuals had actually been recruited by ISKP from afar in Europe, and all of them were of Central Asian origin. Just wanted to clarify that point.
Thanks, Ariane.
So sorry, just wanted to jump in on, I would agree with what Ariane is saying, and I just wanted to sort of clarify that I think if you look at some of the published work coming from ISKP's leader, I think this is what they're sort of emphasizing that the tactics that we're using now will be different from what we have used in the prior years. And absolutely, ISK has, there was a time when it was targeting state actors much more than civilians, but now their civilian targets and attacks outnumber their state targets, which, is more terrorist tactics. And I would also say that I think ISK does respond to whenever it faces some counterterrorism pressure. So if you can call it that, what the Taliban have been doing towards ISK, there's no doubt that the Taliban did come under pressure because they were sort of denying the level of threat that they faced from ISK, but then they had all these very public assassinations of Taliban leaders by ISK. In response to that, they sort of responded with their own targeting of ISKP leaders. So ISK obviously responds to that pressure, but it also adapts, right, in certain ways. So at certain times, we've seen an increase in attacks in Pakistan, but that's the time that we also see more of a focus on expanding its regional influence and international influence. But this is something that ISK does. It adapts to its environment, especially when it faces different types of counterterrorism pressures, which also makes it, I guess, is one of the reasons what makes it resilient.
That's really interesting, Amira, and I want to come back to that briefly, and then we can go maybe to Iftikhar and the rest of you. So helping us understand ISKP's target selection. So if I'm understanding, Amira, what you were just laying out very helpfully, am I correct that you see ISKP's focus on more external targets, be it in Pakistan or maybe even these recent attacks that we've seen in Kerman, in Iran, in Moscow? Is that in part a response to the pressure that ISKP was coming under from the Taliban and a shift in strategy to set their sights outside of Afghanistan? Is it motivated by something else? Kind of help us understand how we can judge the logic, the strategy driving what does seem to be more of a focus on external attacks versus working and conducting major attacks in Afghanistan proper. Maybe go to Iftikhar first and then back either Amir and Aryan.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just for the clarification of Mr. Aryan, what I actually meant to say was that since the attacks against the Taliban have reduced, the propaganda to recruit from within the Taliban has sort of increased. And so those physical attacks have now gone into more propaganda attacks against the group's belief system to sort of get more manpower towards ISKP's side. So just for the sake of clarification, coming back to your question, Elizabeth, ISKP, in terms of its agenda, as a referential point, the caliphate in Syria and Iraq has always been detrimental for the attacks that it has managed to carry out in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Whether there are attacks against Shias or whether there are attacks against the Taliban, or whether there are attacks against Russia or Iran, the referential point is always that some part of these elements were responsible for the downfall of the caliphate in Syria and Iraq. Although even before, and that's when the responsibility and the propaganda sort of work together to sort of quantify each other when they're claiming certain attacks. But even within core ISKP ideology, obviously trying to carry out attack in a Kirman on the death anniversary of Qasim Soleimani is also a symbolic gesture by the group itself to show that it has the capability of carrying out such bigger attacks. And Moscow, of course, is a shocker for the world on how a group could actually, within the heart of Russia, could manage to carry out such attacks. But in terms of identification of ISKP's attacks, if the leader Shahabul Muhajir's books, three books that he's written in terms of what the next 8 years plan for the group is like, and this book was written somewhere in 2018, it is very clear that in 4 years' time, ISKP was going to come out with external operations. Part of it is also in reflection to the propaganda that the group has been disseminating, which clearly shows that it's actually looking at loosely affiliated migrants in the West to actually carry out attacks because it wants to build up its reputation as the sole jihadist entity that can react to certain news headlines against the Muslim world, globally. So whether there is the issue of the Palestine or the burning of the Quran in Sweden or any other incident that appears that has Islamic influence attached to it, ISKP will always jump the ship to sort of get that find people who the group can facilitate to carry out the attacks. But what we've seen is, and I think that that's one of the successes for the group, and even more dangerous than actual terrorists carrying out attacks. For the last couple of attacks, which is in Dagestan as well as Belgrade, and I think there was another one also which I keep on forgetting. These are all inspirational attacks, where the group itself also says that they neither financially supported them, neither was there any direction that was given, which clearly shows that they have managed to steer some mindset of a population through their propaganda within the Western sphere that could actually aid the group's propaganda even further.
Amira, Aryan, anything to add there?
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. I agree with Iftikhar's analysis on that. And I think that this was always a part of ISK's plan, because immediately, as soon as the US withdrew and the Taliban took over, we saw ISK sort of expand its recruitment-oriented propaganda and really make a concerted effort to further widen its militant base, right? So it was already diverse to begin with, but we see more focused and localized narratives where in different languages, right? Additional languages. Also, they started their Voice of Khorasan magazine, right? So their ISK's propaganda very closely reflects its strategy. So it was always ISK's plan to expand regionally and inspire or remotely be connected to some of these attacks overseas. I think, based on the propaganda in Tajik and Uzbek language, it's pretty apparent that this was a part of their plan. But I also think their linkages to these external attacks, especially against Western powers or major powers like Russia, Iran, really serve to unify or sort of create a common thread or motivation for this very diverse militant base, right? So an Uzbek militant may not necessarily care so much about an attack on the Pakistani army, but I think all of these militants who have grievances against even their own governments or governments in the West can get behind the fact that their local governments are puppets of these various other major powers, which they comment on in their propaganda. So I think it also has a unifying effect, a way to sort of make their militant base, which is very, or even supporters, very diverse, sort of stay focused and coherent to the extent possible.
Thanks so much. Aryan, please.
Yeah, just quickly to add to that, to what Amira and Iftikhar said, my assessment is that, of course, ISKP did have the plan, but also, as Iftikhar mentioned, this rise of ISKP attacks at the global level, to me, it has more to do with the downfall of IS Central in the Middle East. And we see a lot of evidence of that. For instance, the Al-Siddiq office that was responsible for financial support for ISKP in the region of Afghanistan and Pakistan, we see that it is now receiving much more assistance from other ISIS branches, the other 10 branches across the world. The Al-Qarar office that is located in Somalia didn't really have a lot to do with ISKP prior to the Taliban takeover 3 years ago. But now we see clear evidence of the Al-Qarar office really, really ramping up its activities in collecting financial dues from across the world and sending it over to ISKP in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we see a clear. And the third is that over the past several months, at least over the past year, I would say, every attack that ISKP has conducted across the world, now maybe not inside Afghanistan, but outside of Afghanistan, has not actually been claimed by ISKP. It's been claimed by IS in general, whereas actually we know that it is ISKP. So to me, with the downfall of IS Central in the Middle East, now ISKP of the 11 caliphates, not caliphate, 11 provinces, if you will, that IS has across the world, seems to be the most eligible one to really take the role of the leadership as we go into the future.
Great point, Ariane, and I'm glad you brought up the funding question. That dovetails with a few questions from the audience that we've received, but one in particular that I'll highlight from a viewer named Kashmala Dilawar, which is, what are the funding strategies that are currently being used by ISK? Where are they getting the resources they need to exist? We know through reporting that's been done, there was a recent piece actually that just came out in the last couple of days on this that has shed some light on these groups, but help us understand, is this a franchise model? How much of this is being driven from donations, the role of new technologies like cryptocurrencies that create problems for countering terrorism financing? And maybe put it in perspective, is ISKP's model similar to or different from some other groups that are operating in this region as well? Ariane, I see you're off mute. Do you want to give it a start, and then we'll go to the other?
Sure. So as I mentioned, there are two offices that are responsible for collecting dues and financial means for ISKP. Of course, the Al-Siddiq office is responsible for collecting financial assets from inside Afghanistan and Pakistan area. Now, the Al-Siddiq office existed before, and they did that. But over the past three and a half years, since really Sanaullah Ghaffari took over the leadership, I see a diversification and increase in the sources of financing. ISKP, for instance, prior to Sanaullah Ghaffari taking over, never really delved into the drug business. But now we see clearly that they are involved, not in opium trade, because opium is really going down. What is going up in Afghanistan is methamphetamine and amphetamine. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that ISKP right now is actually involved in both the production and in the smuggling of methamphetamine and amphetamine, which overall seems to be really taking over the heroin business in Afghanistan. So it's a multi-billion-dollar business, really. And ISKP has a good chunk of that. Other sources that they had in the region before, one of the main sources before was, of course, the illegal logging in eastern Afghanistan. As you know, we have very dense forests in Nuristan, in Kunar, in Nangarhar, and ISKP was involved in the illegal cutting and selling of logs, and that continues. Extortion was there and continues. Some legal business, of course, some legal businesses, something that I see in the travel industry, and also in the internet provision industry in Afghanistan and Pakistan, it's claimed to ISKP have some. So there's a lot that is really being collected and generated locally in Afghanistan and Pakistan region, but also globally through the Al-Qarrar office in Somalia. Now, before, when I was in the former Afghan government, we would see very little evidence of any funding really coming from IS Central to ISKP. But now we see the flow of funding. What I see, much of that flow of funding is really coming, it's getting collected by the Al-Qarrar office in Somalia, but then it's getting channeled into Afghanistan and Pakistan region through Turkey, really. Turkish authorities arrested a few months ago, I think a couple months ago, this Tajikistani national, Dadyu Davidge. He was known also as Abu Miskin. Now, he was responsible for collecting all that, channeling all that Al-Qarrar money into ISKP. And as you mentioned, Elizabeth, they're also using extensively and heavily using cryptocurrency, which makes it very, very difficult really to track. So what I am seeing right now, they're really not in lack of money, and they're really, unfortunately, fully funded.
Iftikhar, Amira, anything to add there? Or I can go on in the interest of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Initially, I remember when ISKP was first formed in 2014 and 2015, and some of the earlier cells when they were investigated, because they were following in Zarqawi's footsteps. So when Zarqawi was released from jail in the 90s, the first thing that he did was he got a visa for Pakistan and came down as a honey trader. And we saw that some of the ISKP cells were involved in trading honey and dates. And they had actually heavily invested into the Pak-Afghanistan trade as well as the transit trade initially. There is enough evidence of that, but somehow that has now died out. And between 2018 and 19, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, we did see that the Islamic State's forerunners, they had actually set up NGOs that were working in somewhat capacity as philanthropic workers and looking for funds and for people who could actually fund some philanthropic work, which the money was obviously being sent to the Islamic State. And a lot of detail has been given by Aryan, so I don't want to go into more of the details. But one thing that we do see, it's not just the hidden Bitcoin platforms which ISKP is using to fund itself. It's even like open source funding, such as the GoFundMe.com, which is being used by ISKP. And usually the way that it is shown is that there's an account that is set up showing that somebody in Afghanistan is a widow and requires an amount of assistance. And then that is usually floated amongst ISKP members to share that this is the account that is present. It's our account, and sort of start funding towards it, and it will be sent to ISKP. That's one of the tactics being used. But obviously, the large scale that we see is done through cryptocurrencies, which is openly available on the encrypted channels of ISKP, and anybody can donate to that. But also, Elizabeth, some of the research work that we did into the monetary side of the Islamic State, not just within Pakistan, but in other places as well, as the Khorasan Diary, the finding was that only like 20% of the group is operational in terms of involved in operational attacks as well as planning of attacks. And the rest of the 80% is propaganda and logistics, which is much larger than what we actually see. So if we go by numbers of known ISKP individuals or the number of attacks, that number actually explains the extent of the organization, not just for its financial part, but also for in terms of the number of languages and translations and the entire media setup that has been put forward by the group.
Great point. All right, we are coming to our last 15 minutes, so we can do maybe a lightning round of questions here. One from my colleague here at Stimson, Barbara Slavin, that I have been wondering about as well. We've touched on the relationship between IS Central and ISKP, and particularly with the challenges that IS Central is facing. I'm wondering about how the situation in the Middle East today, which obviously is quite focused on developments in Israel and Gaza, Iran, Lebanon. There's a lot happening in the Middle East, and at least I haven't heard too much about the role of IS Central there. To what extent have you all seen any sort of messaging or outreach related to those developments in the Middle East, the war in Gaza? Is that being used as an animating strategy for either IS Central, ISKP? Do you expect any downstream effects within the region based on that? Is there something that we can learn in terms of where attacks are likely to be targeted or the focus of ISK going forward? Thanks. Feel free, anyone who wants to come in on that. John?
I can provide some quick thoughts on that. So based on what I've seen, and it's not just ISKP, but also AQIS, for example, or TTP. I think TTP has been trying to generally convince the international community that its agenda is very much Pakistan-based. It is not interested in external targeting. So its commentary on what's going on in the Middle East, specifically with regards to the Hamas attack and subsequent conflict, has been fairly muted. Where you see sort of AQIS come in, I think this is fresh material for their propaganda, but also to sort of justify their narratives that, you know, the West or the non-Muslim world is really targeting Muslim communities around the world. Therefore, this justifies our agenda and, you know, using jihad as a platform to fight these injustices against Muslim communities. So I think what we may be seeing more in the region is using whatever's coming out of the Middle East to justify their own narratives, and to mobilize support.
There's obviously enough propaganda, as Amira has also mentioned, by groups like AQ and Jamaat Ansarullah, as well as other smaller organizations as well. But for ISKP, as your question is concerned, I think they're very anti-Hamas. They're not very forthcoming for that particular organization. And there have been individual efforts by ISKP in which they produce some doctored videos to actually show that it is ISKP that is the Islamic State, attacking Israeli soldiers, which were obviously doctored videos. They were not actual incidents that took place. So obviously for the Islamic State, their agenda for that is totally different. And in its anti-Iran stance as well, it's very difficult for the group to actually place itself into that frame of, but obviously there is material to suggest that some of the motivations that they have been actually giving to more of a younger audience across the West is based on the Palestinian cause. And the recent operation that ISKP actually, the Islamic State Central launched globally, which was that they are from us and we from them, is actually one of the theme lines for that was obviously the operations, in Palestinian and for the liberation of Palestine.
All right, I want to spend our remaining time here a little bit focused, actually, Ariane, coming to you with what you mentioned in terms of the leverage that you think the US, the international community have based on your conversations with the Taliban. We've gotten several questions in the Q&A wanting to hear a little bit more about that, specifically with regards to the commitments the Taliban made under the Doha Agreement, which you detailed. Help us understand where you think those areas of leverage are, not just for the US, but of course for other countries that have been impacted here, right? Iran, Russia, China. Can you take us through how you think the international community might be able to work with, to pressure the Taliban on these issues?
In 3 areas, specifically, the United States has quite a lot of leverage over the Taliban. Number 1, of course, is diplomatic leverage. I see that the Taliban are really, really, really willing, and they're putting quite a lot of importance in building good diplomatic relations with the United States. They see their relations with everybody else on the one side and relations with the United States on the other. This is even more important to them than anything else, really. So diplomatic leverage is quite a lot. And I think the United States government can use that diplomatic leverage if the US government really decides. Now, the Biden administration doesn't really have the will to do so, given President Biden's, to me, really personal views on Afghanistan and how disastrously he handled this whole thing. So President Biden has not really been willing to even talk about Afghanistan. But hopefully with the elections coming up and a new team coming into the White House, the hope is that they would actually recognize that diplomatic leverage. And I am hoping that both for the sake of Afghanistan, sake of the region, and for the sake of the United States interest, that they would actually use that diplomatic leverage in a positive way. Second is financial leverage. I mean, as you know, between $40 to $50 million every week over the past 3 years have been airlifted into Kabul. Now, that money is actually going through by the United Nations, but 75% of that money is actually donated by the United States. This has amounted to billions of dollars over the past 3 years. So $50 million every week is $200 million per year. That's $1.2 billion, per month, $1.2 billion per year. That's a substantial amount of money. Now, it doesn't go directly into the Taliban, but of course, much of that is being used and utilized in one way or another. That financial assistance is key. It's very important. And the US does have quite a lot of leverage in how it could play that. And then third, of course, is some limited military leverage. Now, I'm not suggesting I have 2 hats. I'm an Afghan, I'm an American. I am not suggesting at all, nor do I think it is in the interests of the United States to deploy troops again to Afghanistan. We've had troops there for 20 years and we saw the results. But even the over-the-horizon counterterrorism operation with the drones that the US has, it provides quite a lot of leverage there. Now, I'm not suggesting that they will be used against the Taliban leadership, but from a deterrence perspective, really, it has a lot of leverage, and the Taliban do, by heart, understand that leverage and that threat and that deterrence effect. So, with regard to many of the countries in the region, they seem to be dealing with the Taliban on a day-to-day basis. They know that they cannot trust this type of a system to really do long-term engagements. I can actually see that many of the countries in the region, even the Iranians, are really waiting to see what the United States will do with regard to the Taliban regime and with regard to the future of Afghanistan. So in this case, it is really the US that has the leverage, and the US can have that leadership. In fact, I think the United States government does have both the moral responsibility and the strategic responsibility for the US interest to really engage to really resume those Doha talks and to ensure that the Doha Accords are fully implemented. And the good news is, and I know it is very tough to sell anything to do on Afghanistan in Washington. You know that very well. But the good news is that it does not require much investment, neither in financial investment, nor in military, nor in diplomatic. With very, very minimal investment on these three fronts, things can change there, and things can change for the better. For the more stability, bringing more stability in the region, and to ensure longer-term United States interests in that region.
Thanks, Aryan. Iftikhar, if I can come to you next, similar question, but if you could help us understand how this is viewed in Pakistan, which has struggled to try to use a mix of engagement and coercion, as you detailed, with the Taliban to shape their behavior, particularly with regards to TTP, but also ISK to an extent. Help us understand any lessons learned over the past 3 years from those attempts, where you see any prospects going forward along the lines of what Aryan was suggesting and leverage that might exist. And also, if I could ask you to bring in the China angle as well. We've gotten several questions about China's relationships with the Taliban. Obviously, CPEC is deeply implicated here. We've seen the TTP attacks against CPEC assets. So help us understand both Pakistan's and China's own attempts to shape the CT space in Afghanistan. Whoops, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I think Aryan has put it very well. In the larger CT space, I think for the Doha agreement to solidify and actually be exemplified as an agreement that was signed with approvals from Pakistan as well, because Pakistan is obviously one of the signatories to the Doha agreement as well, but it hasn't not. The United States does hold the moral ground for its implementation as well. Now, there have been attempts to indulge the United States in Afghanistan by Pakistan. We've seen the Pakistani ambassador very recently pledging for more weapons from the United States openly, saying that there is a CT problem that is arising over there. In Pakistan, as many as the US diplomats have made it to Pakistan so far, to have these discussions, and some of these discussions obviously are off the record, but the theme that surrounds it is that Washington and Islamabad sort of agree more than they actually agreed in the last 20 years on what the future of Afghanistan is. I think it will take them another 6 to 7 months, and one of the reasons that alliance between Pakistan and the US vis-a-vis Afghanistan hasn't sort of framed to be a public phenomena or an operational phenomenon as yet is probably the wait for the elections in the US, for the new administration to come in. But it will happen for sure, because it's very clear all the indicators are there. As far as China is concerned, it's very clear that China looks at its relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan very differently, and with Pakistan as the state of Pakistan very differently. We have hardly seen any efforts from the Chinese to actually put them both together and sort of judge them in terms of how it would be. And a very wonderful crystallization of it is actually this attack that took place on the Chinese, engineers within Pakistan's limit. And it was Pakistan that was held accountable for it, despite the fact that Pakistan kept on saying that it is from Afghanistan where the TTP is operating. So I think they're very clear in terms of their diplomatic setup and how to deal with this particular problem. But not to say there have been efforts. Even on the sidelines of the SCO meetings, Russia and China had made these gestures unofficially to Afghanistan as to not sort of, distort its relationship with the Afghan Taliban. In Pakistan, usually it's still not completely understood by the public. And I'm not saying the government setup, because there is an overt realization over there that the Taliban's relationship with the TTP is very clear. But for the last 20 years, the state narrative was that the TTP and the Afghan Taliban were two different entities. Now, to undo that post 2021 within the public realm and its mindset is not very easy. And there is a history that is attached to it, as well as of the peace negotiation process, which is just 3 years down the line, and it's still fresh within people's memories, where the TTP was brought to the table to talk to. So there is somewhat a distrust between governments, but that in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but that distrust is sort of seeping on both sides of the borders as well. And that is why we see some of those, problems which have been persistent even during the Karzai and Ashraf Ghani regime, still, lingering down within the Taliban. Probably at that time, they were less violent. They're becoming more and more violent by the day.
Thanks, Iftikhar. Amira, I'll come to you for the last word, as unfortunately our time has flown by. And welcome any thoughts overall in response to what Aryan and Iftikhar has shared, but particularly on this question of what can be done. CT cooperation with the Taliban. We've gotten a number of questions looking at the limits of the possible. What can be done? I think counter narcotics also comes to mind, given what we were hearing about methamphetamine funding. Help us understand, in your view, the policy takeaways from your research, particularly on ISK, but more broadly on the Afghan CT landscape as well. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, which does not have a straightforward answer. I think what this discussion overall has revealed is the problem of militancy in general in the region is very complex. It has a long history, right? The landscape is very fragmented, and the environment is very conducive to militancy in general. And the fact that there are large informal economies across the region which allow also collaboration between criminal networks and these various militant groups, because it's mutually beneficial. That is a key problem. We have a lot of corruption and weak law enforcement across the countries in the region, which then feeds into making societies vulnerable to the extreme narratives that these groups put forward. Another issue which I think we sort of need to be focused on, and I think this is the overall thought that I would leave our audience with, is we've had at least 20 years of conducting various counterterrorism measures, CVE, softer approaches, and we kind of have an idea of when tactics like leadership decapitation will work, when negotiations will work, which areas we need to sort of adopt more softer approach, reintegration, right? But I think part of the problem is that there's no coordination between countries. And what we're seeing now is, sort of a deep embeddedness of networked terrorism, where affiliations, as Iftikhar mentioned, are very fluid, right? So these groups are poaching each other's militants in addition to recruiting new ones from civilian populations. So this network terrorism is not something that can be just handled by one country, because they draw their resources and strength from the range of countries in the region. And what makes it difficult to come up with a coordinated response is that a lot of the countries have a deep mistrust, right, of other. There's so many conspiracy theories. Every time there's an ISK attack, Iran is blaming Pakistan. Pakistan is blaming India. India is blaming I don't know who in the latest round. So what we really need is first trust building measures between these state actors. And I think that is where the US can play a role to facilitate. I mean, the US has no interest to actually have any deep involvement in Afghanistan or related issues. But what it can do is sort of help with intelligence sharing, for example, or support mechanisms which allow these countries to engage in more trust-building measures, which can then lead to more coherent counterterrorism and CVE policies.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all of you for joining us, to our audience for tuning in. I have learned a lot in the course of this conversation, and I only wish we had a little bit more time. We will have to get back together soon. Many congrats again to Amira and Andrew Mines for their book. Would really encourage you all to check it out. It is a great resource. Thank you once again for joining us, to all of our panelists, and we will be sharing a recording of this event as well as a transcript in the coming days, so it can be a resource going forward. Thanks again to you all. Have a great day or evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.